Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be discussing Craftworld Eldar Howling Banshees in 10th edition. And they've gone through quite a change. They're a lot less deadly than they were before. As you guys remember, Howling Banshees were basically a one-click delete button in 9th edition. You threw them into pretty much anything, even vehicles, and they would just simply be deleted. And that was because they had +1 to wound. The Exarch basically had double its attacks. So with the mirror swords and +1 to wound, and on top of that, piercing strikes, which gave the Exarch +1 damage, things could get pretty insane against a lot of different enemy units. And in fact, they would never have to wound things on a 6. Because of that +1 to wound on charge, the worst they could do was wounding on 5+. You stacked this on top of other buffs that you could give them. They had an additional AP on their weapons, AP -4, and basically any lighter target that you hit would be annihilated. People have even been known to kill very strong vehicles and dreadnoughts with these things. And that's pretty insane if you think about it, because last edition they were only 110 points. Well, this edition, they're a little bit less expensive, but, well, they're a lot toned down. They don't have the abilities that they did last edition, and a lot of players are scratching their heads wondering, well, how do we use Howling Banshees now? And what I'm going to tell you is they're definitely not a one-click delete button anymore, and their role is much more narrow. So how do we use Howling Banshees in 10th edition? Well, let's go ahead and dive right into it. But first, let's go ahead and just look at a quick overview of today's video. We're going to be looking at their stats, weapons, and special rules, their strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies, and lastly, the role Howling Banshees play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. As far as their base stats, they have movement 8, which is slightly better than other aspects on foot, which is pretty fast. They have a 4+ save with a 5+ invulnerable, just like most fragile aspect warriors. They do have a 4+ invulnerable in combat. As for their attacks in melee, they have a decent number of attacks at 3, and all of these attacks are made at strength 4 with AP -3. So basically a power weapon with an additional AP. The Exarch weapons are also decent. The Triskele and the Executioner stand out to me personally for being the better ones. Still nowhere near the mirror swords of last edition, and the mirror swords of this edition are pretty bad. Because basically all you're getting is double the attacks of the Banshee Blade, but when you compare that with the Executioner or Triskele, it's not much ahead of them. So yeah, mirror swords not the greatest. Executioner looks to be the strongest option, followed by the Triskele. As for the ranged weapons, they are armed with pistols, which aren't bad, and the Triskele has a ranged profile as well, with 3 attacks, strength 4, AP -2, and that's basically why I said that the Triskele wasn't that bad of an option. Probably better than the mirror swords, just because you are getting a lot more attacks out of it. You combine this with things like unparalleled mastery, you can reroll a hit roll and a wound roll when they shoot as well. The Triskele seems like a decent option. As for their abilities, they have the fights first, which is fantastic. That means they will fight first, even if they do not charge. So if your opponent decides to charge them with something and not shoot them with something, again, probably not going to happen, just because of the fact that they do strike first, and your opponent will know this, so most likely they'll be shot at. But if that happens, they can strike first and deal their damage before your enemy. If they're already engaged in combat and they manage to survive your opponent's counterpunch, then they will also strike first during your enemy's turn. So fights first is a useful ability regardless of their actual damage. The unit can also advance and charge, or fall back and charge, giving them massive threat range. And this is really, I think, their best ability. They kept it from last edition, and I'm glad they did, because this gives them an insane threat range against enemy targets. With their movement of 8 and an advance roll of 6, if you use a command point, of course, on a stratagem, or you spend a fate dice, that's 14 inches of movement plus an average of a 7-inch charge, which obviously you could also use a fate dice for as well. So you can get some pretty insane charges off with these ladies. The Exarch, of course, can take a Triskele, Executioner, or mirror swords. I'm actually an oddball in this, and I like the Triskele just because you get an extra reroll in your shooting. You know, you actually have an attack that makes a difference for your unparalleled mastery detachment ability. So that's pretty good. It is only strength 3 though in close combat, so that's the trade-off, right? Is that you're not getting as much strength, but you do get a shooting attack from it, and it benefits greatly off of things like rerolls to wound, which if they're dropping out of a Falcon, you definitely want the Triskelay. If you're not, you're just in a Wave Serpent or something, you'll probably want to take the Executioner for that extra strength and damage. The Mirror Swords, I'm just really disappointed with. I don't think they have enough attacks to warrant their use. They only have damage 1. And yeah, in pretty much every other way, they're worse than the other two options. The Banshees can be taken in units of 5 or 10, 85 points for 5 and 170 points for 10, so they're a bit on the pricey side. They're about 17 points a model, which for everything that got cut off of them seems like a little bit much. Remember, they lost +1 to wound, they also lost their Exarch powers, and they lost a lot of other little things. So, yeah, including an AP in combat, so they used to be AP -4. So from last edition to have only lost 2 points off their profile seems a little bit off to me, but then again, most melee units in the game got nerfed in the exact same way. Which, let's just address that really quick. I know that GW made that choice to nerf combat, but did they really need to nerf it? I mean, was combat that OP last edition? I mean, I know there were some movement shenanigans competitive players would pull and stuff like that, which made sense to nerf. But to also nerf the melee profiles of basically every single unit in the game that specializes in combat, that's a little bit bonkers to me. And it harkens back to the days of 5th edition, where I remember in 4th edition, combat was a very big part of the game. And in 5th edition, they completely nerfed it and no one ever took anything in close combat. Except if it was super, super tough, like a huge Death Star or something. And even then, it was very rare to see. So I'm kind of sad about this. I'm sad that melee got nerfed across the board and you're not really seeing much melee combat in people's armies, which is a true shame. I think close combat is one of the best aspects of the game. And it's really one of the reasons why I chose Eldar in the first place, because they could do so many different things, including close combat. And to see that get nerfed across the board was kind of a hard blow. But anyway, I digress. Let's go ahead and talk about their keywords. So they don't have much in the way of keywords, actually, just the infantry keyword, which does allow them to move easily through terrain features. And that's really why you want these ladies, right? They can move easily through terrain. They have a long threat range. They're basically like a bullet you can send to intercept enemy units. And the infantry keyword does help with this. As for their strengths and weaknesses, their strengths are that they have good AP, which they still have good AP. Everything in the game got nerfed in that way, so considering AP -3 is still very strong. They have a good melee threat range. Again, having a basically 14-inch movement with an advance that you can charge after is nothing to scoff at. Fights First is also a pretty powerful ability now that priority goes to the defender. So that will go to you, even though they don't force enemies to strike last or ignore Overwatch anymore, which also sucks. Fights First is still a powerful ability. As far as their weaknesses go, they're very fragile and extremely vulnerable to Overwatch. This is not something that happened last edition just because the Banshee Mask ignored Overwatch. But now, since you can Overwatch in the movement phase, Overwatch is 24 inches, there's a lot of units out there that can just make really great use out of that on small, fragile, expensive units like Howling Banshees. So yeah, they're extremely vulnerable and they're often going to put themselves into positions, because they're a combat unit, in which they will be overwatched. Which, unfortunately, I think is their biggest weakness as a unit in this edition. They also don't hit particularly hard for their points cost, and I've noticed this in my games where I've played my unit of Howling Banshees. Even running them with the Triskelay out of the Falcon, they just don't seem to hit that hard against targets that they were really good against last edition. Even Intercessor squads, which last edition they would have murdered with ease and absolutely laughed as the blood of their enemies washed over their bodies, this edition, not so much. They'll run into an Intercessor squad, they'll probably kill 2 or 3 models, and then the return hits will hurt. They also don't have a natural -1 to hit. That was replaced with a 4+ invul save in close combat, which is not as good. Especially if you're going to plan to kill the enemy unit before they kill you. It's just not really that great. It's also not really great against regular attacks that don't have much AP, as they already have a 4+ armor save. So if you're going against attacks with no AP anyway, a 4+ invul save is pretty useless. And 9 times out of 10, I would rather take the -1 to hit. But since they don't have it, that is another weakness of theirs, that they don't really hit hard by themselves and they need to be boosted by something to be effective. So what are some ways that you can boost these girls so that they can have a little bit better self-esteem? Well, Jane Czar gives them a free heroic intervention. She's basically Mama Banshee, and she comes in there and whips them into shape. She gives them +1 to hit, and she also has very good combat stats, and she's not that expensive. She's only 105 points, which is one of the cheaper Phoenix Lords. She gives free heroic intervention, which, by the way, is really good with fights first, if you can manage to get it. And remember, even if she's the only one that survives, she'll still be able to use it for free. +1 to hit also helps, and yeah, she's good. She's solid. Dropping out of a Falcon also gives them rerolls to wound. You can combine this with Jane Czar to get some really good damage out of them, which they desperately need because they are very low strength and they don't have +1 to wound anymore again when they charge, so they're in desperate need of those rerolls. Wave Serpents can also help them deny Overwatch, which is really good. Remember, Overwatch is one of their biggest weaknesses. If you have a couple Wave Serpents, you can force some Battle Shock tests on enemy units. And of course, this could be any unit that forces Battle Shock. Death Jesters are pretty good. And also, of course, Wraith Seers, which also force Battle Shock. But a Wave Serpent is just, in my opinion, more reliable. Does mortal wounds too, so you're probably going to pop a Marine off, which will help them win that combat and possibly deny Overwatch. This isn't a guarantee, though, so it's important to note that even though it does help, it might not always help, because they could easily just pass that leadership check. Eldrad can give +1 to wound with Doom, and this is a very good combo, and I would recommend using it this way. If you are running a more defensive build, you can have Banshees in a Serpent waiting in the back, or in a Falcon, which is the best option. You can have Eldrad waiting in the back as well, and when enemies approach, you pop Eldrad out, you use Doom, you use the Banshees to hit that unit, and now they're rerolling wounds at +1 to wound, which is very strong. And pretty much gives them a similar punch as they had last edition. Of course, not as punchy, but still considerable, and still enough to wipe out a unit of 5 Space Marines. Units disembarked from a destroyed transport are also battle shocked, and that's important to know, and this opens up a lot of possible combos that you can use with them. And I actually think one of the better ways to use Howling Banshees in this edition, with all the vehicles that are in it, is to use them as a unit that goes after enemy units that have disembarked from a transport, having had the transport destroyed. So using a unit of Fire Dragons, or using your Vipers with Bright Lances or whatever to destroy an enemy transport, you can then follow up with Howling Banshees, who will not be overwatched because that disembarked unit is automatically battle shocked. On top of this, there's a chance that models disembarking from a destroyed transport will be killed. They'll take mortal wound damage. So for each, I think, 1 you roll, you take a mortal wound to the unit. Now, this might not kill anything, but it might kill a couple models, 1 or 2 models if you're lucky, and that will also help the Howling Banshees be able to win that combat more easily. So do look out for opportunities like this, because Howling Banshees are very good at clearing large distances and can very easily reach the mid-board from your deployment zone on a disembarked unit. So having gone over their synergies and combos, what role do Howling Banshees play in 10th edition for an Eldar army? Well, they do nowhere close to the damage they did in 9th, that's for sure, and they really don't have anything new to make them stand out. They didn't get any new special rules, like a lot of our Aspect Warriors did, to make them any different than what they were before. But now that they have significantly less damage, they're really not going to hit as hard as they once did. However, what they did retain was their incredibly good threat range, and as such, they're a useful interception unit to quickly counter lighter threats. A lot of opponents will like to run interference in your backlines by running small, lightly armed units to kill things like Guardians, Rangers, support weapons, those squishy backline units that you will inevitably have in your army. Well, Banshees are good at intercepting these types of units and killing them, just because those units are usually taken in squads of 5, and they're usually not that threatening as far as their shooting goes. They're usually combat-based units. So Assault Marines, Jump Pack Marines, Scouts with melee weapons or something like that. And typically their Overwatch is going to consist of pistols, which your opponent is never going to waste the command point on. So Howling Banshees in the backfield, intercepting these units, wiping them out, and clearing out the threat is a good way to use them. However, even so, they do need the support of a Falcon, Wave Serpent, or Jane Czar to be able to deal the damage to kill them. Even Scouts now have 2 wounds apiece, so it's a little bit hard for one unit of 5 Howling Banshees to wipe out a full squad of 5 Space Marines, whether they're Scouts or whether they're regular tactical Marines. And in most cases, those units will punch back hard if you don't have the damage to take most of them out. So that's why you do need a Falcon, you do need a Wave Serpent or Jane Czar to ensure that they hit hard enough to kill the unit. And some of you might be saying, well, Proxy Hammer, these guys are really expensive now. They're much worse than they were last edition. I'm just going to stay clear of them because it doesn't seem like they're very effective at much, and the role that they do have is very narrow. And while that is true, the role that they do have is a little bit more narrow than before. The types of damage they deal is not as strong as they were before, obviously. And the units they can tackle in close combat is nowhere near last edition. That is true. But you do need some combat units in your army for various tasks, and Howling Banshees can get in places that other units cannot. So, if there are units that are hiding behind ruins, Howling Banshees can take them out. And again, with the new terrain setups that GW suggested for the community, you'll probably see more obscuring terrain in the center of the battlefield. My personal group doesn't use that terrain layout, but there have been talks of using that terrain layout going forward because, it is GW recommended and it does seem like a pretty balanced terrain setup. So I'm glad they actually did this. This was one of those things I talked about in a lot of my videos last edition was, we need a example setup of terrain for the community so that they know how to set up their boards. And finally, GW got the memo after years and years and years of just awful terrain setups at local events, things like that. We're finally getting somewhere with terrain. So yeah, if you use the standard setup for match play with GW's terrain layout examples in the rulebook, Howling Banshees can have a role in killing units that are going to be behind obscuring terrain in the midboard. They have enough threat range to reach those units very easily, whereas some of your shooting units may not. And that little scout sniper squad that's sitting just at the back of those ruins, you might want to take those out because they could be a threat to your Spirit Seers, they could be a threat to other things, and you won't be able to get to them easily with much else. Yeah, if you have Warp Spiders, you can definitely do it. But Warp Spiders, again, more expensive and probably want to be working around the flanks to score on objectives and things like that because Warp Spiders are very good at objective play. So Howling Banshees aren't. They're terrible at objective play. So you might as well use them for that. So yes, they do have much more of a narrow role, but the role that they do perform is still very important in an Eldar army. Okay, so in conclusion, despite them doing less damage than in 9th edition, most melee units took a hit in 10th edition. Let's be real, they did. Basically, game-wide, melee units took a hit, so it's no surprise that Howling Banshees would too. Because of their long threat range, however, and the fight's first ability, they can deal with threats that you're shooting might not be in a position to threaten. Things that are behind obscuring terrain in the middle of the board, for example, or units that are just hidden from the rest of your army, like lone operatives or, scout snipers. Things that have a bubble that say you can't shoot me out of a certain range. Your Howling Banshees don't really care about that, whereas other units in your army very much will. With Jane Czar, Doom, and a Falcon, or a max unit, their damage is good enough to kill most small infantry units as well. And in the case of Jane Czar, she does considerably good damage by herself. So you will be able to murder pretty much any 5-man, and you could even threaten 10-man units with that build. She is a little bit expensive though, so just keep that in mind, and it's probably more worth it in most cases to just max out a Banshee squad. But if you do want to run them in a Falcon, her unit can be very deadly on the counterattack. And she also gives free heroic intervention. So if your opponent is running multiple melee units in their army, actually a good opponent I've kind of found this to be effective against is orcs, because orc shooting is not that great. It's decent, but it's not anything spectacular. And with their Overwatch, I guess they'll be hitting the same amount as usual with Overwatch, but their shooting just isn't generally that strong. So you can kind of get away with charging into their melee units and then counter punching when needed. right? A unit of 5 with Jane Czar will easily be able to take out a unit of 10 Beast Snagas, typically with Doom and with buffs from the Falcon. So rerolling wounds, getting +1 to wound potentially with Eldrad. Jane Czar just absolutely makes a mess out of single wound infantry with her sweep profile. And yeah, the Beast Snaga Boys 5+ Feel No Pain is probably not going to be enough to stop all those wounds coming through. And then you could always use Heroic Intervention later if you need to. If they're within range of another unit that your opponent charges, that is, which will probably be the case because you're going to be using these more defensively in most cases. So yeah, Howling Banshees are still good. I think they're obviously worse than they were last edition, but so is every single melee unit in the game pretty much. Except the ones that could shoot, like Terminators and stuff like that. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help is greatly appreciated. If you do want to support the channel further, I'll leave my links in the description for you guys. And go ahead and check out the channel store when you guys get the chance. There's a lot of cool Eldar-inspired merchandise there for you to rep your favorite faction in your local game store. So check that out if you want. And also, just to let you guys know, I'm running free trials on my Patreon now. So if you don't want to pay for anything and just want a, place in the Discord community for free, you can do so. And of course, you can cancel the free trial at any time and still have access to our community Discord forever. My goal is to build a community up and give you guys access to a forum in which you guys can talk about all those strategies in a fun, cooperative, and of course, judgment-free kind of way. All right, guys, have a good one. See you later. Have some great games this weekend, and peace out. See you guys in the next video.